Okay, so for those of you who were here last week, and I suppose also for those who were not part of it last week, so we're talking about Treatise HaMeisim, that there's this teaching in the Mishnah, Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelek lo'olam haba. Every single Jewish person has a portion in the world to come, and we've described that the world to come does not refer to Gan Eden, the world of souls. It specifically refers to Treatise HaMeisim, the resurrection of the dead. So there's an understanding that we live in our world right now. I don't know what you think about it, but the truth is it's a place of spiritual darkness. In other words, in simple English, we just don't see the spiritual wood for the trees. We don't see what's going on in our world. We don't appreciate the godliness that might be around in our world. So that's our world right now. It's a place of darkness. It's kind of a spiritual blindness, if you wish. When a person passes away, when the neshama is released from this world, and the neshama goes on high to what we call Gan Eden, so then suddenly the eyes are opened and you're able to experience and enjoy a much deeper and more profound and more tangible experience of godliness. And that's great. That sets the neshama on fire. It's a wonderful thing. Olam haba, the world to come, which we're using as a reference to the time of the resurrection of the dead, that's after Gan Eden, meaning to say it's beyond Gan Eden. It is after Mashiach comes, meaning to say that it's an even greater experience than what will happen when Mashiach comes. It is this incredible revelation of godliness that is exponentially beyond what was available in Gan Eden. So this has raised a question for us, because you would assume, and it's quite logical to assume, you would assume that if something is a more accessible, meaning to say a lower, simpler kind of spirituality, you would assume that it's more accessible. And if something is a greater, more advanced level of spirituality, you would expect that you need to qualify in order to experience it. So what strikes us as strange is, why is it that Gan Eden, which is a lesser degree of divine revelation, has very high qualifications that a person needs to achieve in order to get to Gan Eden, and maybe not everybody does get to Gan Eden. Yet on the other hand, Olam Haba, otherwise known as Treatise HaMeisim, the resurrection of the dead, which is this incredible revelation of godliness, a way greater experience of godliness, Kol Yisrael, it's open season, anybody can get in, there's no requirements, there's no waiting room for the Zoom. You just get in, just like that. So it doesn't seem to make sense to us. And that's what we'll begin to explore today. I say begin because, as is often the case in Hasidus, specifically when you study a Maimer, there are no quick answers to questions. If you ask a profound question, then you have to anticipate that in order to get a good answer, you're going to have to go through a profound experience. I think this is the reason, incidentally, why Jews always answer questions with a question, right? You know, the fellow who asks his Jewish friend, he says, why do you Jews always answer a question with a question? He says, why not? So what is it about us that we answer a question with a question? It's quite simple. It's not because we're trying to be evasive or difficult. The reason we answer a question with a question is because in Judaism, we believe absolutely that before you can get a real answer, you actually have to question what you were thinking. If I answer a question just simply by saying, you had a good question and I have a sufficient answer, then you walk out of there thinking, okay, you did give me a sufficient answer, but my question was still relevant. What we want to achieve is that when you walk out, you say, the answer is so compelling, I'm not even sure why I asked the question in the first place. Now with this new insight, this perception that I now have, I appreciate that the question I asked originally was just simply because I didn't have the first inkling of what was really going on. So that's what we're going to do over here. We're not just going to answer a question. We're going to go on a journey. And that journey begins by exploring one important distinction between the experience of Gan Eden and the experience of the world to come. So starting with a text in front of you. Unekudas echad habiurim bazehu. So the core of one of the explanations, so it immediately implies that there are multiple explanations to this particular issue, but we're going to focus on one of them, and we're going to focus on what he calls the nekuda, the key element of this particular explanation. Kimavur b'chama drushim, as is explained in many other places in Hasidus, is as follows. Shehaschar de Gan Eden hu al esek haTorah, v'haschar de Trias HaMesim hu al kiyum hamitzvahs. Okay, so this is important information because there are two primary channels of connection between us and God. One way in which we connect is through the study of Torah. And every one of us is obliged to study Torah. For those people who are learning the daily Rambam, today's mitzvah in the Rambam is the mitzvah to study Torah. And it's different for different people. Some people have the ability or the time, and they should actually be learning Torah for hours a day. In fact, the Rambam takes it for granted that a person could commit to 9 hours of Torah study a day, no problem. Okay, anybody here doing 9 hours? Something to consider. So there's one level of Torah study. That's firstly the time commitment. And of course, it's not only a time commitment, it's also an intellectual commitment. So depending on how intellectual a person is, there's a different expectation. Somebody who's a little bit more simple, we don't expect that you're going to delve deeply into what you learn. You learn it, you get the basics, you move on. Somebody who has great intellectual ability or a lot of existing knowledge, well, then you can't get away with a superficial kind of learning. You've actually got to invest. So that mode of connection between us and Hashem is quite personal. No two people will ever learn Torah in the same way, and no two people are expected to learn Torah in the same way. So don't compare yourself to somebody else, and it's not a competition. How much have you learned, and how much have I learned, and how many books have you completed, and how many books have I completed? It's a completely personal kind of connection between us and Hashem. So the reward for Torah study is something that the neshama will experience in the bodiless experience of Gan Eden. Whereas the other channel of connection that we have to Hashem is through mitzvah observance. So let's say that you had to take Moshe himself and he would put on tefillin. How many mitzvahs does Moshe get when he puts on tefillin? It doesn't matter that he's the greatest prophet who ever lived. It doesn't matter that he's the ultimate teacher of Torah, that he's the one who brought the tablets down. It actually makes no difference. How many mitzvahs does Moshe Rabbeinu get when he puts on tefillin? 2. The mitzvah of the arm tefillin and the mitzvah of the head tefillin. Now let's say that there was some nudnik Chabadnik standing on a street corner, as Chabadniks do, and somebody happens to walk past and he says, "Excuse me, sir, are you Jewish?" And the person says, "Half Jewish," which is never a good thing to tell a Chabadnik, because now you're in for a full interview and a background check on all of your relatives. So he says, "I'm half Jewish." So the Chabadnik says to him, "Which half?" He says, "My mother's mother was Jewish." Now here we're talking about an individual who doesn't know the first thing about being Jewish. He was brought up in a completely secular environment, told that he's half Jewish, so at best, maybe he'll get presents on Hanukkah and under the tree at the same time. That's like the most Jewish experience that he has. And the Chabadnik says to him, "Listen here, I'd like to tell you something, that as far as Judaism is concerned, you are not half Jewish, you are 100% Jewish. Would you like to put on tefillin?" And the guy says, "Sure, I have no idea what you're talking about. What is this thing and what is the cost?" So he gets told it's free. That's how you know he's Jewish, because he's happy now that it's free, he'll do it. So he rolls up his sleeve and he gets guided by this Chabadnik who's probably 15 years old. And he starts to tell him, "Okay, repeat after me, Baruch Atah." He has no idea, he's never done this, never seen it before. He hasn't even watched Fiddler on the Roof. How many mitzvahs does he get when he puts on tefillin? Exactly the same as Moshe Rabbeinu, as Moses himself. There's no distinction. He doesn't even know what it is. He doesn't appreciate why we do it. It's irrelevant. Mitzvahs are not considered based on your appreciation and understanding. A mitzvah is a mitzvah is a mitzvah. No matter who does it, no matter where they do it, no matter why they do it, a mitzvah is a mitzvah. So unlike Torah, which is completely bespoke, mitzvahs are all-inclusive. Where does a person experience the reward, the spiritual reward for having done mitzvahs? That's at the time of Trias HaMesim, the resurrection of the dead. So now we have a clue, because we're already wondering, what's the difference between Gan Eden, which is the experience of souls after this world, and Trias HaMesim, the resurrection where souls return to this world? And we try to understand how is it that the one has access for every single Jewish person and the other one depends on your abilities. Well, here's our first big clue. Because Gan Eden is associated with Torah study, and Torah study is very different for each individual, whereas the Trias HaMesim experience, that is for people who are doing mitzvahs. And mitzvahs are equally accessible to every single person. Let's explore this further. וזהו שגן עדן הוא עולם הנשמות נשמות בלוי גופים. וזהו שגן עדן הוא עולם הנשמות נשמות בלוי גופים. That's why the experience of Gan Eden is an experience of disembodied souls. Whereas of עולם התחייה יהיו נשמות בגופים. Whereas the experience of the resurrection of the dead is dafka, souls that are returned into bodies. And I think that that's something that many people find to be very, very strange. Why would we have an objective, a spiritual objective, like one day when things are really amazing, your neshama will come back into a body? A lot of people find that to be very strange, very paradoxical. So why is it that Gan Eden is a disembodied experience and Tchias HaMeis in the resurrection is an in-body experience? Well, now we start to understand why. Because ki eisek ha-Torah shayach bi'ikr le'haneshama v'kim ha-mitzvahs le'haguf. Because if you think about it, the primary way that Torah impacts us is at a soul level. And the primary way that mitzvahs impact us is at a body level. What does that mean? So again, let's go back to our two examples. Let's say that there's a person who sits in front of a Gemara, because of course that's the icon of learning Torah, is Gemara. We know that through the course of history, most Jewish learning has centered around the study of Gemara. It's intellectually challenging, it's diverse in subject matter, it's basically what's kept Jews Jewish, is learning the Gemara. So you have a person who sits in front of a Gemara, has absolutely no inkling of what's going on. The words swim on the page in front of them. So can you walk out of there and say, I learned something today? Nobody would say that. I learned something. You didn't learn anything. You looked at a page. You sat there with a blank stare. You're not familiar with the language. You didn't understand the concept. You can't say that you've learned something. Why? You did all the physical things. You shockled back and forth, right? Everybody will tell you that as a Jewish person, as long as you start to sway, you must be learning. If you're not learning, you must be davening. It's got to be one of the two. So you did that. You swayed back and forth. Doesn't help. Learning is not a physical experience. It's got to get into the mind, and the mind is a more spiritual part of who we are, especially when the content that we're learning is not simply intellectual content, it's spiritual content. That's what happens when you learn Torah. You're not learning another book of philosophy or another form of science. You're learning spiritual information. And spiritual information, this is a fascinating thing about Torah, incidentally. Spiritual information is processed only partly through the brain and primarily through the soul. That's why there's certain topics that we learn that the intellectual mind actually cannot grasp. For example, one big subject within Torah is to learn about God himself. Now, the human mind is incapable of understanding God. It's a non-starter. It's not possible. Why? A very simple reason. Because the human mind understands things by defining them. That's how we understand. How do you understand something? You define it, which means you give it parameters, you give it limits, you give it descriptions, you give it labels. That's how we understand things. And Hashem is undefinable. So all of the tools that the human brain has are all the wrong tools to try and understand Hashem. In fact, as the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, says in Tanya, it would be as ludicrous to suggest that a person can with their brain understand God as it would be to suggest that a person with their hand could grasp a mathematical concept. It's the wrong tool. You don't use hands to grasp intellectual concepts, and you don't use a brain to grasp a spiritual or certainly a divine concept. So Torah, which is spiritual and divine wisdom, yes, it uses the brain to process the information, but actually your soul is what's understanding it. So the experience of Torah learning is an experience of the soul. The experience of mitzvahs is an experience of the body. How do you do a mitzvah? Well, that's the key. You do it. And do, deed, action, that implies the body. So how does a person put on tefillin? With your brain? No. With your neshama? No. How do you put on tefillin? You take the tefillin out the box and you wrap it physically around your arm. And then you place it physically on your head. And a neshama that's living in Gan Eden can have the most wonderful experience and connect to Hashem and be completely overwhelmed and have tremendous insight, but it can never, ever do the mitzvah of tefillin, because without a body, there is no way to do tefillin. So we've learned two key things here. We have learned that there's a direct correlation between the study of Torah and the experience of souls in Gan Eden. So Gan Eden is called the reward for Torah. And there's a direct correlation between the performance of mitzvahs and the experience that will happen at the time of the resurrection of the dead. So the resurrection is called the reward for mitzvahs. The second thing that we have identified is that Torah learning is an experience of the soul, and performance of mitzvahs is an experience of the body. So those two things are going to be very useful for us to try and understand what's going on over here. וכיוון שקיום המצווס הוא בכל ישראל, שאפילו פויש ישראל מלא מצווס כרימון, לכן כל ישראל יש להם חלק לעולם הבא. Now we have our first clue why not everybody gets into Gan Eden, but everybody gets into the resurrection of the dead. Why? Well, to get into Gan Eden, you have to know Torah. Let's be honest. If we were to do a poll of all the Jews living on the planet right now, how many of them could confidently say, I know Torah? And that, by the way, includes many of the religious ones as well. I know Torah? No, I don't know Torah. I read the parasha of the week. I know a few things about Jewish practice. I learned half a Gemara once. How many people could say they know Torah in the way that Hashem expects it of us? Not a lot. So if Torah is the access point that you need in order to get to Gan Eden, and most Jewish people are not that familiar with Torah, we get it. Not everybody's getting into Gan Eden. They might need a whole lot of repair work, or their neshama might have to be recycled. But if mitzvahs are the ticket to get you into the next world, into the experience of the resurrection, and whatever that entails, everybody's got a mitzvah. Everybody's got a lot of mitzvahs. That's the funny thing about mitzvahs. You could be doing dozens of mitzvahs without even knowing it. Think of it. Every single time that a person follows certain basics of human conduct, you're already doing mitzvahs. You have the temptation, you really would like to share a juicy piece of gossip, but you choose not to. You don't know that it's a mitzvah not to. You just think it's not nice. So you keep your mouth shut. That's a mitzvah. Bingo, right there. Every single time a person treats their parents with respect, that is a mega mitzvah right there. Okay, so the person hasn't done all the research about what the Gemara tells us about it. Doesn't matter. You've done the mitzvah. And for that reason, we have an expression that the Gemara says that all Jews, even Poishe Yisrael, which means the malicious rebels of Judaism, the terrible backstabbing Jews, so to speak, are filled with mitzvahs, like a pomegranate is filled with seeds. Oh, by the way, let's quickly debunk a little bit of a myth over here. There's a myth that people have that Judaism believes that pomegranates have 613 seeds. And when it comes the time for Rosh Hashanah and you put a pomegranate on the table, inevitably there's going to be one curious child who wants to count the seeds. And you have to tell them, listen, can't touch them. Nobody's going to eat it after you've fingered every seed. But where does this come from? There's no such teaching in Judaism that says that a pomegranate has 613 seeds. What it does say, which is what we've just read, is that every single Jewish person is filled with mitzvahs in the same way as the pomegranate is filled with seeds. So there's a beautiful interaction that once happened. A fellow came, a big Torah scholar, came to the Rebbe, our Rebbe, and he said, I have a difficulty with this quotation. You know, the Gemara says that even the sinners of Israel are filled with mitzvahs like the pomegranate is filled with seeds. He says, I don't understand. How could the Gemara suggest such a thing? There are sinners, for heaven's sake. If there are sinners, how could you possibly say that they're filled with mitzvahs like the pomegranate? And the Rebbe says, you know, it's so interesting because I've also battled with the same line in the Gemara, but for the exact opposite reason. Because as far as I see it, if these people are filled with mitzvahs like the pomegranate, why do you still call them sinners? And that's really how we should look at it. Who are we? What kind of a chutzpah? Who gives you the right that you could label another person and say, sinner? What do you know what's going on? Do you know the value and the weight of one mitzvah versus the other? You don't know. Could be they've done one mitzvah in their life that outweighs all of your mitzvahs and you would never know it. But even besides that, as far as we're concerned over here, mitzvahs are inescapable. How's that for a thought? Mitzvahs are inescapable for Jews, right? Oh, that's interesting. Somebody just posted privately on the chat that there was a study that was done that says the average number of seeds in a pomegranate was 613. I'd love to know if there's a source for that, because I've actually heard to the contrary, but we're not going to debate the seeds in a pomegranate. What's the point? The point is that mitzvahs are inescapable for Jews. You understand what that means? That means a Jew could run 1,000,000 miles and say, I want nothing to do with my Judaism. And guess what? They'd still be doing mitzvahs, dozens of them on a daily basis. So because the mitzvah experience is completely universal, that tells you why every person will have an opportunity to share in the Tchias HaMesim, the resurrection of the dead, because the access point is universal. As opposed to Gan Eden, which relies on Torah study, and not everybody's learning Torah, and certainly not at the same level. Okay, so what have we got so far? We've solved this thing, right? We started off with a question. The question was that there's an implication that everybody gets into the experience of the resurrection of the dead, and not everybody gets into Gan Eden. We found that strange because we said Gan Eden is not as advanced a spiritual experience as the resurrection. So surely, if you can't make it over the threshold of Gan Eden, surely you can't make it into a much higher, more advanced spiritual experience, the resurrection of the dead. Now we've addressed that. We said, well, there's a reason, you see. Because Gan Eden is linked to Torah study, and not everybody does that. And the resurrection is linked to mitzvah observance, and everybody does that. And shkoyach, thank you very much. Let's end the shir at this point, because we've got an answer, right? We're good. Only we don't really have an answer. We've just done a kind of match column A and B. Torah, Gan Eden, because Torah speaks to the soul, and Gan Eden is for souls. Mitzvahs, Tchias HaMesim, because mitzvahs are physical, and therefore everybody does them. And Tchias HaMesim, resurrection, is for the physical experience. But we haven't yet explained why. We haven't yet explained what that actually means. There's got to be a deeper layer to this. What does it mean when we say that you have these two modes of connection? Okay, here's a very interesting question. It's a pity that it's anonymous. But are women included in Gan Eden because of studying Torah? It's a very interesting question. If you have a look in the Rambam today, it's a little bit of an aside, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but if you have a look at the Rambam today, it says that women are not obligated to learn Torah. So if you're not obligated to learn Torah, and Torah is the access point in order to get into Gan Eden, is Gan Eden a completely male-dominant society? So the Gemara addresses that, and the Gemara says that there are a few things. Firstly, that there are areas of Torah that every single person is obligated to study, and both men and women. So there are certain areas of Torah study that women are not obligated to study. That doesn't mean that they're not obligated to study at all. Second of all, every single time that a woman encourages her husband to go and study those parts of Torah that he has to study, then she gets 100% of the benefit of the mitzvah that he has performed by studying Torah. So she shares in the Torah study. That would be the simplest way, I think, to address it. Well, can you only imagine the protest outside Gan Eden if people were told no women allowed? I mean, we have some very vocal Jews in our community. You can only imagine what happens when they get up there. Okay, so let's dig deeper. Let's try and unpack this at a whole different level to what we've learned so far, which is nice, and it's a connect the dots, but it hasn't given us the depth of insight that we'd like to have. So, V'yesh loymar. Just move that a bit so you can see where we're up to. V'yesh loymar. Anybody who's familiar with the language of Hasidus, and particularly the language of a mimer, which is a deep discourse within Hasidus, you'll know that the expression V'yesh loymar, which directly translates as you could possibly say, this is the point at which the particular Rebbe who's teaching the particular mimer starts to introduce his own personal insight into the story. I did mention to you last week that a mimer, anybody who had watched a mimer happen, you get the sense that it's just like this divine knowledge flowing without any break right through the person, right through the Rebbe. So still, this is the point that our Rebbe is teaching us that perhaps is not around in preceding teachings of Torah. Yesh loymar, dezer gam ma shemamshich b'mishnah shenemar v'amech kulam tzadikim lo'olam yushu oretz chulei. So what he's going to do now is he'll tell us, so far we've only looked at the first part of our Mishnah, the Mishnah that we quoted from the Tractate Sanhedrin, that says, Kol Yisrael yeshlam chedek la'olam haba, that every Jew has a portion in the world to come, and we said world to come means the resurrection. But there's more to the Mishnah. It doesn't stop there. It says shenemar. That means that it brings a verse, brings a pasuk to justify, it's a verse from Yeshaya, the prophet Isaiah, that justifies this position. What's the pasuk? The pasuk says, "Va'ameich kulam tzadikim," your nation are all righteous. La'olam yirshu aretz chulei, they will always inherit the land. Okay, so we're going to focus on that. What does this mean? They will always inherit the land. By the way, there's more to the verse that we're still going to quote a little bit later in this paragraph. So Diyesh Loimar, let's explain it as follows. Shekavonas HaMishnah b'shenemar chulei hi loy rak lehavi raya al zeh shekol Yisrael yesh lam chelek lo'olam haba elo gam levoer hatam al zeh. When you read Talmudic argument, when you read a Mishnah, when you read a piece of Gemara, and it says shenemar as it is stated, usually that is what we call evidence. So in other words, the Gemara is telling us, how do you know this is true? We have an original source. A verse in the Torah is called an original source. So we've got an original source, now we know that this is true. But over here the Rebbe proposes that not only is this verse an original source, so we know that all Jews have a portion in the world to come, but it's actually an explanation how we know, or why it is. So let's see. The mi shemekayem mitzvahs nikra b'shem tzaddik. A person who observes mitzvahs is called a tzaddik, a righteous individual. Why a tzaddik? So he says parenthetically, the chol ha-mitzvahs nikru b'shem tzedakah, or mekayme ha-mitzvahs nikroim b'shem tzaddikim. Because every mitzvah is referred to under a catch-all banner tzedakah. So even though you and I think of tzedakah as just giving cash to charity, but actually tzedakah is a name that is the collective noun for all mitzvahs. So because all mitzvahs are referred to by the name tzedakah, the practitioners of mitzvahs, which is you and I, are called tzaddikim, people who do tzedakah, i.e. people who do mitzvahs. Therefore, this verse is telling us that every member of the Jewish nation is a tzaddik, i.e. somebody who fulfills mitzvahs. Because as we've already seen, every single Jewish person, including the biggest sinner, does mitzvahs, and dafka many mitzvahs. So because that's how we are, now this is an important nuance that the Rebbe is going to point out over here. Not only do we do mitzvahs, but the Talmud used the expression that we are filled with mitzvahs. What's the difference between doing mitzvahs and being filled with mitzvahs? So he explains. This is a beautiful insight, by the way. The word filled with mitzvahs means that mitzvahs fill up who you are. Let's understand that for a second. You know, the Jewish community has its fair share of cynics. I don't know if you're familiar with this. We have our fair share of people who are quite cynical about other people's behavior. You know, we're the big tzaddik, and that person, I'm not so sure. I have questions about their integrity. You know, that person's trying to get close to the rabbi because he needs a favor, and that person's trying to show that he's so righteous because he wants people to do business with him. And that, okay, you know how it is. We've got all kinds of opinions about people, and we say there are people who do things, people who do mitzvahs, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's who they are. You know, occasionally, and maybe not so occasionally, we'd prefer it was more occasionally. Occasionally we hear a story about a Jewish person who ostensibly is religious, and then they do something that's illegal. Or they do something that is unbecoming. You turn around and say, what is this? What's going on over here? Who is this person? All of that stuff is just a show. And vice versa. You will get people, unfortunately, in the Jewish community, you will often get people who will say, those guys, yes, they come to shul on Shabbos, but does it really count? They drive. That person, they keep such a strict kosher home, but they're dishonest in business. You know, we're cynical like that. And so often what we think is that the mitzvahs are water off a duck's back. That's what we believe. Because as far as we're concerned, in our perception, we don't see the impact of that mitzvah on that person. Comes along the Talmud, and the Talmud says, even Poishe Yisrael, the biggest sinners of Israel, meleim mitzvahs. The mitzvahs that they do actually fill them. Maybe you don't see it. Maybe that's because we don't have the right perspective. Maybe that's because we look at the world through human eyes. We don't know how to look at the world through divine eyes. But the way Hashem sees this person is that all of those mitzvahs fill the person. That's who they are on the inside. You see the difference? Most of us think that the mitzvahs that people do, that's who they are on the outside. That's just the things they do. But then on the inside, there's somebody who's dishonest. There's somebody who's disrespectful. There's somebody who whatever. The Gemara sees it the exact opposite way around. The sins are what's on the outside. The mitzvahs fill them. That's who they really are. That's why we can say with confidence that every single Jewish person will inherit that land. What's that land? Because the verse says they'll inherit the land. Which land? Eretz HaChayim. The land of life. That's what they'll inherit. The land of life, which refers to ultimate life, what's going to happen in the world to come. So what are we seeing here? We're seeing that the Mishnah tells us, not only does it make a powerful statement that every single Jew has a portion in the world to come, it brings a verse from Tanakh to corroborate the statement. And that verse from Tanakh actually tells us something spectacular. Every Jew is a tzaddik. That's how we have to look at each other. We have to stop this business of always looking at everybody with a critical eye and saying they don't belong to the same shul as I do, and they don't daven out of the same book as I do, and they don't have the same value system as I do, and therefore there's something wrong with them. That might be a personal perspective, but it's definitely not a Jewish perspective. The Torah's perspective is every single one of our people is meleim mitzvahs, is filled with mitzvahs. They're not just mitzvahs that they happen to do and then they move along. It becomes them, it's absorbed into who they are, and therefore every one of them has a portion in the world to come. And that's what the verse is there to teach us. Except that same verse, which is so beautiful and helps us appreciate this depth of what it means for Jews to do mitzvahs, that same verse is going to raise a question for us. This question will lead us to an expanded appreciation of what it means when we talk about the period of the resurrection of the dead. Once we expand our understanding of the period of the resurrection of the dead, then we'll be able to come back and revisit the difference between Gan Eden and the resurrection. But the first thing that we're going to do now is we're going to raise a question that will begin a process of us understanding that Techias HaMeis, the resurrection of the dead, actually has more than one component to it. So what's the question? We're now just, 5 lines from the end of the first paragraph. Omnom, however, so far we've got a beautiful Mishnah. The Mishnah says every Jew goes into the resurrection of the dead, and it brings a verse from the prophet Yeshaya which says every Jew is considered a tzaddik because we do mitzvahs. Fantastic. Why does the Mishnah still bring the rest of that verse which doesn't seem to speak to this theme? How does the verse continue? Neitzer mato'ai maisei yodai lehispo'er. This is what we call good news and bad news all rolled into one. Because this verse is incredibly good news. It's just bad news for the concept we're trying to build. The concept we're trying to build says, access to Gan Eden is via Torah. Access to the world to come, aka the time of the resurrection, is through mitzvahs. Every Jew has mitzvahs, we're good. Now let's see if that's what this verse says. What does the verse say? It's Hashem speaking through the prophet Yeshaya about how he sees us, how he relates to the Jewish people. What does he call us? Neitzer mato'ai, the branch of my planting, ma'asei yodai, the work of my hands, lehispo'er, in which I take tremendous pride. What's he saying? If you read that verse properly, you'll see clearly that what he's saying is, your greatness is not of your doing. My planting, my handiwork. In other words, what's it saying? What it's telling us over here is that Hashem's perspective about the Jewish nation is that we are special to Him even if we haven't done anything yet. Even if we've never done a single mitzvah in our lives. He says, you're precious because I made you. You're precious because I planted you. Whoa, hang on a second. So far, the way that we explained this entire process was that if you want to have reward, if you want to have an experience of divine revelation, you're going to have to earn it. And there are two channels that you can use to earn different kinds of divine revelation. If you go down the Torah channel, you have access to whatever divine revelation is available in Gan Eden, the disembodied experience of the soul world. If you go down the mitzvah route, then you will earn yourself the opportunity to have divine revelation at this extreme level that will only be in the time of the resurrection of the dead. But what's clear in both cases is you've got to work, you've got to do, you've got to invest, you've got to earn. And now the Mishnah quotes, in support of that, a verse that says, you are great because I said you're great. Because Hashem says, I made you. I care about you. I nurtured you. I cultivated you. What makes you great? My choice to make you great. It's actually got nothing to do with anything that you achieve. Now that seems to totally contradict what we're trying to say here. So let's read it inside of our Mishnah. This Mishnah that speaks about the incredible opportunity that we will have to connect with Hashem in the future at the time of the resurrection, in that Mishnah, he quotes this verse, Demizem Mashma, that implies, listen carefully because it's important information, why does every Jew get into the world to come? Because every Jew is special in and of themselves. We are not special because we did X, Y, and Z. We're not special because we collected so many mitzvahs and therefore we're precious to Hashem. We are precious to Hashem because we are precious to Hashem. We're invited into the world to come because we are precious to Hashem. Something doesn't add up over here. Up until this point, we were quite comfortable to say that it's natural and it's expected that Hashem has demands of us. And if we live up to those demands, we get things in return, namely Gan Eden and the world to come. But now, that same Mishnah that implies that we've got to do mitzvahs in order to get into the world to come, that same Mishnah quotes a verse from the prophet Yeshaya that tells us we get into the world to come because of who we are, not because of what we do. So which one is it? Does every Jew have a portion in the world to come just because we're Jewish? Or does every Jew have a portion in the world to come because it's unthinkable that Jews would not do mitzvahs, and once you've done mitzvahs, you're through the front door? Which one is it? So to answer and explain that, this will start us on the journey that we need to go on in order to really understand what's happening here. And that journey is to say there are actually two facets, two components, two realities to the world to come. We're now in paragraph Gimel. So the Rebbe explains, the experience and the divine revelation that will become exposed to us in the time, in that future time of the resurrection of the dead, is a two-channel experience. Up until now, we just thought it was simple. There's one channel of connection called Gan Eden, and a different channel of connection called the world to come, i.e. resurrection. But now we're seeing that even within the world to come, there are again two channels. Let's understand them. Number one, there is Haschar al ha'avodah dekiyum mitzvahs ve'ameich kulam tzadikim. The first experience that we will have in this world to come is we will experience reward for the mitzvahs that we've done. That's the first thing that will happen. Then, okay, so he's going to explain what that means, and then we'll do the then, and then we'll come back. This is the part we'll come back to in a moment. The energy that we have drawn down through our mitzvahs will at that point be revealed. Okay, that's an interesting concept. We'll come back to it in a moment. But here's the point, but then what will happen is we will then be raised to an even higher, deeper experience. Then we'll be elevated and upgraded to a new level of connection between us and Hashem, which is because of who we are intrinsically and inherently, which will be something far more profound than what we could achieve through our mitzvahs. Okay, that's a mouthful. Let's try and pick it apart and understand what's going on over here. So what happens when you do a mitzvah? Let's start with that. What do mitzvahs achieve? Okay, so there's certain mitzvahs, you have a look at them, you understand, I can see the benefit of this mitzvah. Let's say, for argument's sake, the mitzvah of Shabbos. I can see the benefit. We're all run off our feet. We're way too stressed. We need that time out. Boom. You have your Shabbos. There's the reward right in front of your face. You don't have to wait for next world and Gan Eden. There's the reward. You're sitting with your family. You're not, the phone is off. Beautiful. Other mitzvahs, you don't see the reward. What? If you separate meat and dairy, do you see something magical happen in your life? You suddenly start to feel, I feel so calm. You ask people about the things that happen in a kosher kitchen. Do they make you more calm? No. They make you absolutely stressed. Oh my gosh, how did this fork land up in the meat drawer? So not every mitzvah do you see a practical benefit in this world. So why do we do them? People will tell you the reason you do a mitzvah is there's this investment program that Hashem initiated. And the investment program, like any other good investment program, you've got to pay a little bit up front, but the dividends that you get afterwards make it all worthwhile. So during the course of our lifetime, every time we do a mitzvah, we make a deposit into this investment fund. So I would much rather eat whatever I want, but the Torah says I can't, so that's why I eat kosher. Boom, investment in the fund. I would really, really love to tell you the story. I don't know if you've heard it yet. This big scandal. I'd love to tell you. I'm not going to tell you. Why? Because Lashon Hara, investment in the fund. I get up in the morning and I say the Shema. So I don't feel like saying the Shema. I'd much rather stay in bed for it's dark, it's cold. So I'd rather stay in bed. I get out of bed and I say the Shema, investment. One day, after 120 years, the neshama goes upstairs and they say, welcome, here is the dividends on your investment. You did really well, and you've got a villa on the coast, up there in the eternal tropical island, or whatever it is. For many people, that's what mitzvahs are. And it's misguided, unfortunately. Well, you think that's what it is, like some kind of a trade-off. God sticks us down here on earth and he says, do these things and I'll give you nice presents at the end. So what is a mitzvah? We're told that the mitzvah, the word itself, the word mitzvah, is related to the words in Hebrew for bringing together, like in a team, connecting different people together. So like, for example, a tzevet is a crew, a team. Mitzvah is related to that same word, tzavsa, bringing together. So there's a bringing together that happens every single time that you do a mitzvah, a bringing together of yourself and Hashem. What does it mean? What does that mean? Do you feel it? When last did you do a mitzvah and afterwards you felt like something had changed, like there was this divine revelation, your eyes were opened? Maybe it happens occasionally. I would assume like on a Rosh Hashanah, they blow the shofar and you feel this tingling sensation and something happens and your neshama is switched on. But on average, most of the mitzvahs that we do, we just do them and we have absolutely no awareness of the fact that any bond has been created, that any connection has happened. And we certainly do not realize the key of what a mitzvah does, which is hamshacha. Hamshacha means that it brings godliness into my reality. This is the connection. It's not like a connection at long distance. I'm here on earth. God is up there in the heavens, or as we call them, Shemei HaShamayim, the heavens above the heavens, or whatever that means. It's not like there's this aloof, remote, distant God and me and we're making a long-distance phone call, like the famous joke. This means hamshacha. I'm bringing godliness into my reality. But I don't see it. absolutely unaware of the fact that that has happened. And the reason I'm unaware of it is because the eyes that I have are unable to see spiritual things. They're unable to see a divine presence. I know there's some people out there who'll tell you there's an aura and they can read your aura and the aura implies this or that, whatever the case, but that's all very nice. That has absolutely nothing to do with a divine presence. That might be some kind of energy field that's around a person, and maybe it's associated with their personality and maybe even their soul. But it's not hamshacha. It's not what we're talking about over here, which is you draw down infinite divine energy into your space every single time you do a mitzvah. So just parenthetically, let's step aside for a second. That's why we're not in the business of how many mitzvahs you've done, because every mitzvah has an infinite value. Every mitzvah draws down divine energy into your reality, and divine energy is not limited. So you bring down, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, you bring down a connection between yourself and Hashem that is beyond time and space. It is beyond the individual act. So never get caught up in this business of how many things have I done and how frum am I, or all that kind of stuff. Every single mitzvah is mamshich. It draws down godliness, real godliness into our reality. And that surrounds us, and that becomes the environment in which we live. And whether we're conscious of it or unconscious of it, the fact of the matter is it changes the reality of our lives. But it would be magnificent to see it. It would be an incredible thing if instead of just reading about this in a book and having to either buy in or reject the concept, imagine you could actually see it. Imagine how that would be. Imagine you'd be able to tell that you're surrounded by divine energy, which is due to the efforts of you doing a mitzvah. In other words, you own it. You've earned it. It's yours. So it's powerful and it's compelling and it's bright and it's encouraging and it's uplifting and it's everything positive, and it's because of you. You'd feel on top of the world. Anybody knows how it feels, the exhilaration of any kind of an achievement. You push. Something's difficult to do, you push yourself to do it, eventually you succeed in doing it. You know how great and wonderful that feels. You know how beautiful it is to look at the product of your labor and say, I'm so proud. This is the artwork that I produced. This is the book that I wrote. This is the thing that I built. So can you imagine having that experience? Can you imagine having that awareness? Can you imagine having that pulsating godly energy all around you, and it's got your name on it? That's the first level of experience that we'll have in Techiyas HaMesim. The Hamshacha, the divine energy that we brought down into this world, will suddenly be revealed. It's as if somebody flipped the switch and now you can see what was always there, but you were in the dark. It is going to be overwhelmingly exhilarating. But that's only the first part of the process. So you've got this incredible exposure to divine energy. You've got this amazing insight and appreciation for that divine energy, and it's only the first part of the process. Because he says after that, we are elevated, we're upgraded to start to have an appreciation not of what we've done, which would be amazing, but we begin to have an appreciation of who we are. As beautiful as it is to celebrate achievements, it is far deeper and far more powerful to celebrate intrinsic value. In other words, in plain English, if a person is considered valuable because of the things that they have done, there's an undercurrent that says, if you hadn't done those things, maybe you wouldn't be so valuable. This is something that parents always have to be really careful of, right? You read in any parenting expert will tell you that, let's say for argument's sake, a child does something well. Whatever it is, you give them an instruction, they follow the instruction. Or alternatively, you've got a child who comes back from school and they've done really well on their school report or whatever. So any parenting expert will tell you, be very careful what you say next, because you have two choices. The one choice is you can say, you're a good boy, which makes it sound like their value is contingent on what they've done. You're good. Why? Because you did X. You're good. Why? Because you got a good mark. It's a terrible message. You're not good because of what you've done. You're good because you're good. I love you because I love you. You've achieved well. That's an honest statement. You listened well. That's an honest statement. So any time that we celebrate achievement, there's an undercurrent message that says maybe without that achievement, you might not have been as valuable or as beautiful or as loved or as close or as cherished. So in the first part of the experience of Tchias HaMesim, what do we experience? The greatness of what we have achieved, which is amazing and it's beautiful and it's powerful. And then we upgrade beyond that, which is to a place of realizing the preciousness of us in our simple, basic, fundamental form. Me, as me, Hashem loves. Not me as the doer of mitzvahs. Not me as the one who brought down godliness into this world. Not me who got A on the test. Me because I'm me. That's what will happen in the second phase of Tchias HaMesim. So in other words, there are two very profound things happening over here. Every one of us has access to Tchias HaMesim on the one hand because we all end up doing what we need to do to get there, i.e. mitzvahs. And then something even more profound, which is where Hashem turns around and he says, guess what? I think what you did was fantastic. I think you're amazing. You've achieved beautifully. And I would have loved you, and I do love you just as much regardless of whether you hadn't achieved a single thing. Okay, let's go a little further. In fact, let's take it a step further. The ultimate experience of the resurrection, the ultimate revelation that will happen in that world to come will not be the thanks, the achievement, the greatness of our mitzvahs. It will be the exposure of the real value of who we are, our intrinsic value. This is magnificent. That's what's going to happen. We have no clue of our intrinsic value. We battle to convince ourselves that we have a value. We have so many things that make us feel devalued. So many things that make us question whether Hashem is out to get us or maybe is upset at us or whatever the case is. Comes the time of Olam Haba, Tchias HaMesim, what will happen is we'll recognize that there's nothing He values more than us. Because whatever we achieve through doing mitzvah, through performing mitzvahs, and that energy that will be revealed in the time of, so that will be revealed, we'll talk about it in a second. Already when Mashiach comes, before there is the resurrection of the dead, we'll already start to see the greatness of what we achieved by our mitzvahs. As the Alter Rebbe says, the first Rebbe says in Tanya, he says that by doing our actions, in other words, doing mitzvahs now in this world, that's what brings godliness into the world. And the revelation of that godliness will be that revelation will happen in the time of Mashiach and in the time of the resurrection. I'm going to read to the end of the paragraph and then we can unpack it because we're kind of out of time. It's just that in the time of the resurrection, it will be an even deeper experience of exactly that revelation. I'll explain to you what I mean in a second. It's a very powerful point, and it's difficult to end on that point, so we'll have to pick it up next week. But basically what he says is this. There are two major experiences that we're going to have in the future time of Mashiach. The one is the incredible experience of feeling the power of what we achieved through doing mitzvahs. And that will be the most overwhelming, uplifting experience, far beyond anything that we could imagine. And we'll begin to experience that when Mashiach comes, and we'll have a deeper experience once there's the resurrection of the dead. But the key thing that's going to happen at the time of the resurrection of the dead is that we'll get to appreciate how we are linked into Hashem's essence. Now, unfortunately, that expression, to say linked into Hashem's essence, that is a whole big topic in its own right, which we'll have to pick up on, please God, next week.